Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, walking out your front door, and realizing everyone is gone. Not a single soul left on the street. Dinner is still warm on the table. Doors unlocked. Tools left exactly where they dropped. No signs of struggle, no apocalyptic warning. Just absolute, suffocating silence. Throughout history, we measure our legacy in stone. We build monuments meant to touch the stars, convinced our cities will outlast time. But what happens when history plays a cruel trick? What happens when entire empires housing millions of people, boasting advanced engineering and writing, simply evaporate? Today, we aren't just looking at ruins, we're looking at cold, vanishing acts. Welcome. Let's explore 9 chilling theories about ancient civilizations that vanished without a trace. For over 1,000 years, the classic Maya built one of the most breathtaking civilizations in human history. Deep within the suffocating jungles of Central America, they raised towering limestone pyramids that pierced the canopy, mapped the movements of the stars with terrifying mathematical precision, and governed sprawling metropolitan networks. To the Maya, the universe was alive, and their divine kings ruled with absolute, unshakable authority. Then, between the 8th and 9th centuries, the music simply stopped. Imagine the scale of the shock. Millions of people packed up their belongings, walked away from magnificent capitals like Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque, and never returned. There were no scorched battlefields, no mountains of bones from a massive foreign invasion, and no desperate final messages carved into stone. They just left. The jungle quickly woke up, wrapping greedy vines around the palaces, swallowing plazas in emerald green, and reducing the grandest cities on earth to silent, forgotten ruins. For generations, historians argued, how does an entire civilization just evaporate? For a long time, the leading suspect was a megadrought. Academics pointed to climate data showing a catastrophic dry spell that starved the region of rain. But recent, cutting-edge technology, specifically airborne LiDAR scanning that strips away the dense jungle canopy, has revealed a much darker, more chilling reality. It wasn't just climate change. It was a self-inflicted civilizational death spiral. Here's what the ruins are whispering to us now. The Maya were victims of their own engineering and success. As their cities swelled with millions of people, they cleared vast swaths of the tropical rainforest to feed their populations, build massive stucco monuments, and fuel their lime-burning kilns. But stripping away the trees fundamentally altered the local microclimate. It raised temperatures, dried up the soil, and actually made natural droughts far more severe and frequent. Caught in a trap of their own making, the great kings did what rulers usually do. They doubled down. They fought brutal, endless wars against neighboring cities for dwindling fertile land and captive laborers. They increased taxes, demanded more sacrifices, and begged their gods for rain that never came. And then a profound psychological shift occurred. The people lost faith. When the divine kings could no longer guarantee the survival of their people, the social contract shattered. Instead of dying in a glorious, fiery apocalypse, the Maya made a quiet, desperate choice. They simply walked away. They fragmented into smaller, mobile, agrarian groups, scattering into the wilderness and coastal regions to survive, leaving their magnificent urban monuments to the ghosts of the jungle. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Maya. Advanced technology, astronomical brilliance, and towering monuments cannot protect a society that outgrows its local ecosystem. When you bleed your environment dry, ecological collapse breeds political suicide. The Maya didn't vanish into thin air. They proved that sometimes the only way for a civilization to survive its own collapse is to abandon the very things it built. Long before the pyramids of Egypt reached for the sky, or the Great Walls of China were laid in stone, another superpower was quietly rewriting what it meant to live together in an urban society. Spanning modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, the Indus Valley civilization was a marvel of the ancient world. At its peak, millions of people thrived across hundreds of cities, the largest being Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These weren't chaotic, muddy settlements. They were astonishing feats of engineering. Imagine wide, perfectly straight streets laid out on a grid system, multi-story brick homes equipped with private bathrooms, and the world's very first sophisticated urban sanitation and underground sewage networks. Water flowed smoothly, waste was whisked away beneath the streets, and standardized weights and measures suggest a remarkably peaceful, highly organized society built on trade rather than kings and conquest. And then, around 1900 BCE, the heartbeat of this great civilization simply stopped. For decades, modern archaeologists have been haunted by what they didn't find. There are no massive, scorched battlefields littered with weapons. There are no piles of unburied bones, signaling a brutal foreign invasion. There are no grand inscriptions detailing a sudden, cataclysmic war. Instead, what they found was chillingly mundane. Cities left entirely intact. People simply locked their doors, put down their tools, and walked away. For a long time, historians pointed to an old theory, an invasion by mysterious Aryan tribes. But modern excavations and forensic science have completely shattered that myth. The truth is far more quiet and far more terrifying. Recent isotopic and paleoclimate data point to a slow, agonizing natural disaster, a prolonged, multi-century weakening of the monsoon cycles. The great river networks that fed the Indus Valley began to shift, dry up, and fracture. Without predictable water, the intricate irrigation systems failed, and the vast agricultural surplus that sustained millions of people evaporated into the dust. Yet, the people of the Indus didn't die out in a single dramatic apocalypse. They faced a slow-motion unraveling. As the great cities dried up, the hyper-urban lifestyle collapsed from within. Trade routes broke down, centralized administration dissolved, and the population quietly packed up their lives, migrating eastward toward the Himalayan foothills in search of rain. In doing so, they didn't just move, they erased their own identity. They abandoned the grid, abandoned the script, and dissolved into small agrarian village cultures, reverting to a simpler way of life. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Indus Valley. Advanced infrastructure is shockingly fragile. When the water stops flowing, the most meticulously planned, sanitary, and advanced cities on Earth can become uninhabitable husks overnight. The Indus Valley teaches us that you don't need a fiery apocalypse or an invading army to destroy a civilization. Sometimes, all it takes is a silent shift in the weather and a population wise enough to walk away before it's too late. Deep within the humid, emerald heart of Southeast Asia lies one of the most magnificent engineering marvels the world has ever seen. At its height, the Khmer Empire was an unstoppable powerhouse, ruling over a sprawling realm from modern-day Cambodia to parts of Thailand and Vietnam. And at its center stood Angkor, a sprawling, glittering metropolis that supported a staggering 1 million people at a time when London was just a muddy village of wooden huts. Angkor wasn't just a city of stone temples and towering faces carved into sandstone. It was an ingenious, breathtaking hydraulic city. The Khmer rulers were masters of water. Because their region suffered from brutal extremes, months of bone-dry drought followed by months of torrential monsoon downpours, they engineered a massive, complex network of canals, channels, and gigantic artificial reservoirs known as barrages. These water bodies were so immense they could be seen from space. They stored the monsoon floods, regulated the flow, and irrigated 3 massive rice harvests a year, fueling an entire empire's survival and glory. The crowning jewel, Angkor Wat, stood as a living bridge between heaven and earth. And then, by the 15th century, the heart of the empire was abandoned, left behind to the mercy of the encroaching jungle. For a long time, historians blamed foreign invasions, stories of rival kingdoms sacking the city and driving the people away. But recent scientific breakthroughs, including high-tech tree ring analysis and archaeological excavations, have uncovered a far more chilling reality. The Khmer Empire was betrayed by its own masterwork. The very infrastructure that built the empire became the instrument of its destruction. Tree ring data reveals that the region was battered by a severe, punishing climate shift, decades of alternating extreme megadroughts and violent torrential floods. When the massive drought struck, the reservoirs cracked dry, baking into dust. And when the monsoons finally broke, the torrential rains turned into destructive walls of water. This extreme weather battered the intricate canal system beyond its structural limits. Catastrophic silting choked the canals, massive soil erosion wrecked the agricultural fields, and the delicate water balance collapsed entirely. The city could no longer feed its millions, nor manage the floods. The intricate plumbing that kept Angkor alive choked to death on mud and thirst. The population didn't vanish in a flash of war. They starved, rioted, and slowly fragmented, slipping away southward toward regions with better water security, leaving the grand stone towers to be slowly crushed by the powerful grip of strangler fig roots and jungle vines. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Khmer Empire. Mastery over nature is a dangerous illusion. When you build an empire reliant on fragile environmental engineering, a shift in the climate doesn't just inconvenience you, it turns your own greatest achievements into your downfall. The Khmer didn't lose their city to an enemy army. They lost it to the sky and to the water that simply stopped obeying. Imagine standing at the very center of the ancient world during the late Bronze Age. While Egypt and Babylon commanded the rivers and deserts, a true titan dominated the highlands of modern-day Turkey. They were the Hittites, a terrifyingly brilliant military superpower, master ironworkers who forged weapons that shattered bronze, and diplomatic giants who negotiated history's first recorded peace treaty. From their formidable capital of Hattusa, wrapped in massive double walls of stone, they ruled an empire that seemed entirely untouchable. And then, around 1200 BCE, the lights went out. Permanently. In a single, violent flash of history, Hattusa was burned completely to the ground. Palaces were reduced to ash, temples crumbled, and the Hittite civilization vanished from the face of the earth so thoroughly that for centuries they were nothing more than a forgotten footnote buried in ancient texts. For generations, mainstream historians pointed the finger at a legendary enemy, the Sea Peoples. According to this dramatic tale, mysterious, bloodthirsty maritime raiders swept across the Mediterranean, burning coastal cities and bringing down empires like a house of cards. It sounded like an apocalyptic Hollywood blockbuster, but modern science has uncovered a far more chilling truth. The Sea Peoples didn't destroy the Hittites out of nowhere. They simply administered the final, merciful blow to an empire that was already starving to death in the dark. Recent multidisciplinary studies of ancient tree rings and core samples from deep underground have revealed the true culprit, a catastrophic, unrelenting 300-year megadrought that began around 1198 BCE. This wasn't just a tough season. It was an agricultural apocalypse across the entire eastern Mediterranean. As the rains failed year after year, the vast wheat fields of the Hittite heartland turned to dust. Grain silos emptied. Famine swept through the empire with terrifying speed. And when a population starves, the social fabric tears apart from the inside. Desperate citizens rebelled. Local lords fought vicious civil wars for control of remaining food stores. The central government fractured, paralyzed by hunger and internal chaos. When the raiders finally arrived at the gates of Hattusa, they didn't need to break down the walls. They walked into a kingdom that was already tearing itself to pieces over a crust of bread. The fires that consumed the capital weren't just lit by enemies. They were the funeral pyres of a superpower dying of hunger. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Hittites. Even the most advanced ironclad military and the strongest stone walls mean absolutely nothing when nature turns off the food supply. When an empire starves, politics turns cannibalistic, and civilization collapses into the dark, leaving nothing behind but ash and silence. Long before classical Greece gave birth to philosophers and armies, Europe's very first advanced civilization was rising across the sparkling blue waters of the Aegean Sea. They were the Minoans, centered on the sun-drenched island of Crete. If you walked through their world, you wouldn't find towering defensive walls or brutal military barracks. Instead, you would find magnificent, labyrinthine palaces like Knossos, decorated with vibrant frescoes of leaping dolphins, graceful youths vaulting over charging bulls, and a peaceful, seafaring society that lived in absolute luxury and wealth. They commanded the waves, dominated maritime trade, and believed their island paradise was untouchable. And then, in a matter of days, paradise turned into an absolute nightmare. Around 1600 BCE, nature unleashed one of the most cataclysmic events in human history. Just north of Crete lay the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini. For generations, it was a quiet, beautiful neighbor. But beneath the surface, pressure had been building for centuries. When Thera finally erupted, it wasn't just an explosion. It was a planetary-scale planet shaker. The eruption released an amount of energy equivalent to hundreds of atomic bombs detonating all at once. The entire center of Thera blew apart, collapsing into the sea in a colossal crater. The sound was so loud it was heard thousands of miles away. For the Minoans on Crete, just 70 miles south, the disaster unfolded in terrifying waves. First came a pitch-black curtain of night as millions of tons of choking, toxic volcanic ash blotted out the midday sun, burying crops and homes under heavy gray dust. Then came the earth-shattering tremors, tearing apart the foundations of their beloved palaces. And finally, the sea itself turned against them. The collapse of Thera triggered towering, monster tsunamis, walls of water hundreds of feet high that raced across the Aegean at jet fighter speeds. These colossal waves crashed directly onto the northern coasts of Crete, obliterating ports, crushing ships like toys, and wiping out coastal towns in a single devastating gulp. The physical destruction was catastrophic, but the psychological blow was fatal. Their economic lifeline, their shipping fleet and trade network, was completely shattered. Their sacred fields were poisoned with ash and salt. Seeing their weakness, opportunistic invaders from the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans, swept across the sea to finish off what was left. A civilization that had danced with dolphins and ruled the waves for over a millennium was choked by ash and drowned by the sea, leaving behind only ruins and the haunting myth of Atlantis. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Minoans. Geography is a fickle master. Living on the edge of breathtaking natural beauty often means sitting directly on top of a ticking geological time bomb. When the Earth decides to reset, no amount of art, wealth, or maritime mastery can save you from the wrath of a giant catastrophe. Imagine traveling back in time to an empire built nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, high up in the thin, freezing, oxygen-starved air of the Bolivian Andes, right next to the shimmering, deep blue waters of Lake Titicaca. This was Tiwanaku. At its height, it wasn't just a settlement. It was a breathtaking metropolis, a spiritual and imperial capital featuring monumental stone megaliths, intricate sunken courts, and a population of tens of thousands. In this brutal, high-altitude environment where nothing was supposed to grow, the people of Tiwanaku performed a miracle of survival. They engineered a brilliant agricultural technique known as sukakolu, vast networks of raised crop fields surrounded by canals. The water absorbed solar heat during the day and radiated it back at night, protecting the crops from freezing alpine frosts and allowing them to feed a thriving empire. They believed their city was the center of the universe, blessed by the gods of the mountain and the lake. And then, around 1000 CE, the heartbeat of Tiwanaku simply stopped. The city was abruptly abandoned, its grand temples left unfinished, and its proud people scattered into the valleys below like ghosts. For a long time, the mystery of Tiwanaku's fall baffled archaeologists. There were no scars of massive foreign invasions, no cities burned to ash by invading armies. Instead, science revealed a far more agonizing culprit, a slow-motion freeze. Paleoclimate analysis of lake sediment cores and ancient ice sheets tells a chilling story. The region was struck by a severe, prolonged climate shift, a drastic drop in rainfall, combined with extreme unseasonal cold snaps. The Great Lake levels dropped, and the sophisticated wetland agricultural system began to fail. The raised fields dried up or froze solid year after year. The food reserves that kept the empire alive dwindled to nothing. And as hunger set in, the social cohesion of Tiwanaku fractured from within. Archaeologists discovered something deeply disturbing in the ruins: systematic, violent desecration. The great stone statues of the elite rulers weren't toppled by foreign enemies. They were deliberately smashed, defaced, and buried by their own citizens. The temples were ransacked. When a divine ruling class fails to bring the rain or put food on the table, religious faith turns into absolute fury. The populace didn't just walk away, they turned on their own leaders, destroying the very symbols of an empire that had promised them eternal protection against the cold. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of Tiwanaku. When leadership fails to deliver survival in times of environmental crisis, spiritual and political faith shatters into violence. The Andes don't forgive mistakes, and even the most towering monuments of stone cannot stand when the earth itself freezes over and the people decide they have nothing left to lose. Imagine carving your home directly into the sheer, intimidating red sandstone cliffs of an unforgiving American Southwest desert. For centuries, the Ancestral Puebloans did just that. In places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, they built breathtaking multi-story community dwellings tucked hundreds of feet up in canyon alcoves, looking like natural extensions of the rock itself. They engineered complex road systems, tracked the movements of the sun and stars with meticulous precision, and thrived in an environment where survival seemed nearly impossible. They were masters of endurance, finding water where there was none and growing crops in the arid dust. And then toward the end of the 13th century, something deeply unsettling happened. Every single one of these magnificent cliff dwellings was completely, utterly abandoned. There were no smoking ruins of war, no mass graves left by an invading army. Instead, the people packed up what they could carry, climbed down from their dizzying cliffside homes, and walked away. They embarked on what modern archaeologists call the Great Migration, heading south to blend into the Rio Grande and Hopi communities, leaving their legendary stone cities to the silent desert wind. Why would a society leave homes carved into impregnable protective rock? For decades, researchers thought it was just a simple drought, but recent archaeological breakthroughs have revealed a far more complex and chilling narrative. Yes, a severe, prolonged dry spell struck the region, drying up the springs and shriveling their corn crops. But climate was only the trigger. The real catalyst for their disappearance was a dark, internal collapse born of desperation, social violence, and warfare. As resources grew critically scarce, the delicate peace of the community shattered. Ancient bones recovered from the region bear the unmistakable trauma of violence, warfare, and even cannibalism born of starvation. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Society fractured into defensive factions. The cliffs that were meant to protect them from the elements instead became traps. Realizing that staying meant mutual destruction, the leaders made a profound, heartbreaking choice. They decided that their great architecture, their ancestral homelands, and their cities of stone were worth sacrificing if it meant preserving their people. They chose diaspora over extinction. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Ancestral Puebloans. Sometimes survival requires abandoning your greatest achievements. The bravest thing an advanced society can do when the world breaks down is not to fight to the death for a dying place, but to admit defeat, pack its bags, and walk away into the unknown. Imagine standing deep inside a harsh, blistering Arabian desert, surrounded by towering walls of solid sandstone. Suddenly, the canyon opens up, and right before your eyes stands a breathtaking palace facade carved directly out of rose-red rock glowing under the golden desert sun. This is Petra, the legendary masterpiece of the Nabataeans. Long ago, the Nabataeans weren't master builders of stone palaces. They began as a nomadic Arab tribe roaming the unforgiving desert, surviving where no one else could. They possessed a superpower that defied nature. They were absolute masters of water. In a land scorched by perpetual drought, they engineered hidden underground cisterns, clay pipes, and clever channels that captured every single drop of rare desert rain, turning barren canyons into thriving agricultural hubs. By controlling the vital desert oases, they seized control of the ancient world's most lucrative trade routes, the incense, silk, and spice caravans connecting Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. They grew immensely wealthy, built hidden cities carved out of cliffs, and commanded an empire of sand. And yet the Nabataeans didn't fall in a blaze of glory. They didn't burn in a bloody war, nor did they starve to death in a sudden apocalypse. Instead, they simply faded away. For centuries, their hidden canyon capital remained a secret to the Western world, whispered about only by local Bedouins. Why? Because the Nabataeans fell victim to a force more powerful than swords or famine: strategic economic obsolescence. As the Roman Empire expanded and took total control of the Mediterranean, they discovered new, faster maritime trade routes across the Red Sea. Spices and silks could now be shipped directly by sea, completely bypassing the perilous overland camel caravans. Overnight, the bustling trade highway that was Petra's absolute lifeblood dried up. The wealth vanished. The desert reclaimed the roads. But the Nabataeans didn't die out in agony. They adapted, packed up their knowledge of the desert, and quietly migrated away to blend into other populations across the Middle East. They left behind their rose-red city not as a graveyard of bones, but as an empty, silent mausoleum carved for the wind. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Nabataeans. Economic relevance is everything. An empire can survive a drought, outsmart an enemy, and conquer the desert. But when the global market shifts and your entire purpose becomes obsolete, you don't need a catastrophe to destroy you. The world simply moves on, leaving your greatest monuments behind as quiet ghosts in the sand. Deep beneath the fertile black soil of modern-day Ukraine and Moldova lies one of the most baffling and forgotten mysteries of the prehistoric world: the Cucuteni Trypillia culture. Dating back over 6,000 years, long before the first stone of the Egyptian pyramids was ever laid, these people built some of the largest, most densely populated settlements in all of prehistoric Europe. Imagine sprawling megasites housing tens of thousands of people arranged in massive, perfect concentric circles across vast plains. These weren't crude, muddy hamlets. They were sophisticated, multi-story clay-built urban centers featuring organized streets, public assembly areas, and breathtaking pottery painted with mesmerizing geometric spirals. They were an agricultural powerhouse, living in peace, equality, and astonishing abundance. And then every single generation, they did something deeply unsettling. Every 60 to 80 years, the people of Cucuteni Trypillia would pack up their belongings, herd their livestock, and systematically burn their own massive cities to the ground. They didn't flee from an invading enemy. They didn't lose a war. They torched their own homes, temples, and hard-earned monuments, leaving massive layers of ash and burned clay across the plains. Then they simply walked a short distance away, built an entirely new megasite from scratch, and started the cycle all over again. For decades, archaeologists wrestled with this bizarre ritual. Was it a sanitary measure against disease, a spiritual philosophy of cosmic rebirth, a way to prevent social inequality from taking root? Most anthropologists agree it was a profound ritual of renewal, a way to reset society before it grew too corrupt or heavy to sustain itself. But around 2750 BCE, the cycle of fire finally stopped, and the people never returned. What broke the eternal loop? Science points to a brutal double blow: a sudden, drastic shift in climate known as the Payora Oscillation, which brought rapid cooling and severe droughts to Eastern Europe, combined with the encroachment of aggressive horse-riding pastoralist groups pushing in from the Eurasian steppe. The delicate balance of their agrarian ecosystem shattered. The climate turned too cold to sustain their giant agricultural centers, and the encroaching outside world made peaceful relocation impossible. The megasites were abandoned forever, swallowed by the grass, leaving behind only scattered fragments of painted pottery and mountains of ash. Which brings us to the chilling takeaway of the Cucuteni Trypillia culture. Even a society built on the philosophy of cyclical renewal eventually hits a wall when the environment turns hostile, and tradition can no longer outrun climate change. They chose fire as a symbol of rebirth, but in the end, time extinguished the flame for good. As we look back at these 9 ghost empires, a terrifying pattern emerges. We like to think of history as a straight line of constant progress, where humanity grows smarter, richer, and more permanent with every century. But these vanished civilizations whisper a different, darker truth. Collapse is not an anomaly. Collapse is a natural cycle. In almost every case, these societies didn't fall because of sudden Hollywood-style apocalypses. They fell because they pushed their environments past the breaking point, ignored the warnings, and failed to adapt when the world changed. They thought their walls were too thick, their gods too powerful, and their systems too advanced to fail. And that leaves us with the ultimate takeaway. We are not the first humans to believe we are at the peak of civilization. We are simply the latest ones trying to figure out how to avoid walking down that exact same silent path.